Hi, everyone. Welcome to the WOW History Channel. My name is Ron Guth, and each week I'm going to bring you something that changes the way that you view history and makes you say, wow, that is not exactly what I learned in school, and this is not the way it was taught to me. This week we're going to look at a very important book called Uncle Tom's Cabin by Harriet Beecher Stowe. And this is in keeping with last week's episode about slave narratives, and I recommend that you go back and watch that one if you haven't. The history of slaves in America, of course, is a blot on the American way, and so it's important to look at these things and see how our society has evolved. The Uncle Tom reference nowadays is a very negative stereotype. It usually refers to a black person who is considered to be a traitor to his race. So, given that, I thought, well, why don't I go read Uncle Tom's Cabin and see what this bad guy is all about? So I did that, and in doing so, I came up with a bunch of wows for myself that completely changed the way that I view Uncle Tom, and I think will change the way that you view him as well. So, first of all, I would recommend that you get the book, read it, and then give me your opinions. Comment below if you'd like. So, let's look and see why Uncle Tom has gotten a bad rep, because it turns out he really is the hero of this book. The book was written by a woman called Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a teacher and a very staunch abolitionist. She was definitely anti-slavery, and this is what the book is all about. It is anti-slavery. She wrote the book as a serial novel between 1851 and 1852 in a newspaper called the National Era, which was a abolitionist newspaper in Washington, D.C. A serial book means that you just publish a chapter every week, and it took her 40 weeks to complete the book, and then it was finally published in book form. The book was an immediate bestseller. Slavery was a very big issue in the 1850s. It came out in 1852, and it sold over 300,000 copies in the 1800s. It became, and this is a wow, it became the best-selling novel of the 1800s. In fact, it was the best-selling book, second only to the Bible. In Britain, and this is a sort of an intellectual property theft kind of thing, they published over 1.5 million copies of the book, and of course, Harriet Beecher Stowe didn't get a penny from that. Supposedly, the book was so influential that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe in 1862, supposedly he said, "So this is the little lady who started this great war." This is an apocryphal quote. We're not really sure he actually said it because it wasn't published until 1896. And so, but it's a great story. She was inspired to write the book by a book that she had read, and she mentions this. The book was called The Life of Josiah Henson, formerly a slave, now an inhabitant of Canada, as narrated by himself. Now, Josiah Henson was a former slave who ran away, escaped, and went up and lived in Canada. So his book was published, well before Harriet Beecher Stowe's book, and it probably did okay. But when he saw the success of Harriet's book, he republished his own and gave it a new title, hopefully to generate more sales. And the new title is The Memoirs of Uncle Tom. So you can see he was definitely trying to take advantage of her popularity. There are many subplots in this book. Of course, the evils of slavery are riddled throughout. The horrible lives of the slaves, as especially indicated by what happens to Tom. And it's very religious. And this was a wow thing for me too, when you read the book, I mean, it's very religious, very Christian, almost preachy. There are a lot of monologues and conversations where Christianity is brought up a lot, and we see how Harriet Beecher Stowe thought that perhaps Christianity could help make slavery go away. If everybody acted in a true Christian way, they would never be a slave owner. Early on in the book, it starts off with a farmer who has some debts. He's fallen on hard times, and he's negotiating with a slave trader to sell one of his slaves. And of course, the slave that he's trying to sell is Uncle Tom. This is typical of the South. And even today, when farmers need to raise money, they sell off property. And slaves were property, and slaves were quite valuable. And so one of the best ways for him to raise money was to sell a slave, and unfortunately, that's what's happening here. What's really another wow moment is, I mean, really early on in the book, I mean, in just the first page or two, there's a little black child that peers into the room, and Mr. Shelby, who's the farmer, says, "Come on in, Jim Crow." He refers to this child as Jim Crow. Well, wait a minute, I've heard that term before, and you probably have too, especially like the Jim Crow laws of the early 1900s. So I'm thinking, wow, how did that happen? What's the connection there? Are the Jim Crow laws related to Jim Crow of the Harriet Beecher Stowe book? So this is something that we're going to explore in a future episode because it just stuck out, Jim Crow. And the child's name was not Jim Crow, it was Harry. And this is just the way that they referred to young black kids at the time. So anyway, Tom gets sold. He's being transported on a steamboat to a slave market. And along the way, there's a little white girl that falls into the river. And Uncle Tom, being the bad guy that he is, he jumps in and saves her. So he's a hero. And the father of the child buys Tom and from the slave trader and takes him to New Orleans. After 2 years, little Eva, the girl that Tom saved, she becomes sick and she dies. And on her deathbed, she shares a vision of heaven, which induces the father to free Tom, but the father is killed before the freedom becomes official. And so Tom gets sold at auction to the real bad guy of this story, a man named Simon Legree. Simon Legree is, if you can think of the nastiest guy of the 1800s, this is him. He uses his female slaves as sex objects, and in fact, one of the female slaves that he impregnated, she ends up killing the child because she had already been separated from another child earlier in her life, and she said she doesn't want to go through that again, so she ends up killing the child. I mean, this is how horrible it gets. So Simon Legree doesn't like Christianity, and he sees that Tom is a very pious man, not a bad guy, he's a very pious Christian, and Simon tries to beat the Christianity out of Tom, and he almost succeeds. I mean, he just beats Tom and just knocks him down into this terrible state of depression. But Tom does not forsake his religion, his Christianity, and just still, despite everything that happens to him, continues to be a good guy. So in the course of events, Tom encourages two slaves to escape. It's a woman and I believe it's her daughter or another female slave. And they run away, and Tom refuses to tell Simon Legree where they went, and so Legree, in his anger, orders his overseers to kill Tom, and which they do. And it's this horrific scene in the book where Tom is finally killed. And for what? Because he refused to tell the whereabouts of these two slaves that he helped escape. And the sad part of this is, while all this is happening, the farmer that sold Tom in the beginning of the story, he died, and his son came down to New Orleans to try to buy Tom back, but of course he gets there too late. Tom is already dead, so it's just a very sad thing. Now, the effect of Tom's death is pretty significant. The overseers who killed him, they become Christians. The farmer's son, who came down to buy Tom back and came too late, he returns to Kentucky, and he frees all his slaves, and he becomes a Christian too. Here's another wow thing. The 2 slaves that Tom helped escape, they eventually make it to Liberia, which was a nation that was created in Africa for formerly slaves that had been freed. And this is another very interesting story that I'll go into in a future episode, and that is the story of Liberia. And it's just fascinating because so many important people were involved, and it raised a large amount of money. I mean, they bought a country in Africa so that freed slaves could go there instead of staying here in America. So again, why was Tom reviled? Well, the Southerners hated the book. I mean, it was a bestseller up in the North especially, but it was very hated in the South because it was a direct attack on slavery and that peculiar institution, as they called it. They wrote many books about it, and there's a whole genre of what we call anti-Tom literature. And it got so bad that somebody even sent to Harriet Beecher Stowe by mail an ear that they had cut off of a slave. I mean, they just were nasty. They hated it. So Tom has been criticized ever after for being too eager to please his masters and to be subservient. Now, among the anti-Tom literature is a book called The Planter's Northern Bride. It was written by Carolyn Lee Henson, and it tells the story of a northern woman who is the daughter of an abolitionist who ends up marrying a southern slave owner. So you can see the dichotomy there. Here's the daughter of an abolitionist who is anti-slavery, and yet she goes down and marries a southern slave owner. So this indicates that, wow, slavery isn't so bad, or, it didn't affect the life of this woman who came down south to marry a slave owner. Well, it turns out that Carolyn Hens, who wrote the book, and Harriet Beecher Stowe were once very close friends. So you have Harriet Beecher Stowe writing an anti-slavery book, and then you have her close friend writing a pro-slavery book. And it just, as you go through these things, you see these connections and these events that how can this happen? How does this happen? But that's reality, and that's history, and that's life. So what are the takeaways from Uncle Tom's Cabin? Number 1, go out and please read it. Number 2, it was a best-selling book. Number 3, it was you got to be careful because the N-word is used throughout, of course. Number 4, it's very religious. Number 5, the Jim Crow connection that we're going to look at further. But number 6, most importantly, Uncle Tom is a hero, and it's a shame that his name and his reputation have become so negative over the years. So please read the book and find out for yourself, without being influenced by anyone else, why Uncle Tom is such a good guy. Thank you for listening. And if you like the channel, please subscribe. And most importantly, leave a comment below. If you would like a topic to be discussed in the future, I'll take a look at what you're interested in. Anytime we take a look at something and put a fresh light upon it, It's amazing what you can learn. And that's really what history is about. It's learning about our past, learning about the important things that have happened in our lives and why they're still important today. It's part of the problems that we have in our society today is people don't understand history, and therefore they diminish the significance of people, places, and events, and to their detriment. I mean, this American history, of course, has its negatives, but there are so many positives, and we should be looking at things without the filter of the last 200 years, and just learn from these things and try to become better people ourselves. If anything, we should all try to be heroes like Uncle Tom. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.